Seeds of freedom, time has come. Seeds of freedom, life will overcome. Seeds of freedom, all we need is some. Seeds of freedom, life will overcome. Small seed, big tree, gardens of hope, everywhere just to share. Gardens of hope, seeds of freedom, time has come. Seeds of freedom, life will overcome. Small seed, big tree, gardens of hope. Wind blows, seed go from head to head. Seeds of freedom, seeds of freedom, seeds of freedom. Little by little, almighty. Seeds of freedom for seeds, no more slavery, no more suicide and cruelty. Seeds of freedom, stand up together, be ready, be ready, be ready, be ready. Seeds of freedom, seeds of freedom, time has come. Seeds of freedom, life will overcome.
Hello, gentle people. Let's start today's webinar. Whether it's morning, day, or nighttime for you, wherever you may be and whoever you may be, a farmer, a student, a researcher, or maybe an activist, you're so welcome to Seeds of Change, our Youth and International Food Governance.
There is a unique character about his sheep.
This is organized by FIAN
They are
International.
mice. They are dependent,
And the
timid,
last
trembling, obedient.
participant be muted. Yes, wonderful. Today's webinar is organized by FIAN International, IPES-Food, and the CSIPM of the CFS, so the Civil Society Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, and also a team of tireless young people. My name is Ida, and I'm a farmer in training and UN youth representative on biodiversity and food. And it is my absolute pleasure to guide you through today's session. And I think we're going to start with some very important but very practical announcements. We have simultaneous interpretation available in English, Spanish, and French, thanks to the CSIPM translators. So please make use of this feature by clicking on the translation icon and then selecting your preferred language. And please remain muted. And if you want to say something, for example, during our Q&A session, please use the function to raise your hand. And please speak slowly and clearly. This is a note to all speakers, but also to myself, so that this webinar can be translated by our interpreters. Today's presentation and panel are recorded. This is so that this webinar can serve as an information resource for a broader audience. And for our breakout room sessions after the panel, which will not be recorded, please add your preferred language behind your name on Zoom, so that we are able to allocate you to a breakout room in the language of your choosing. So we have a little over 2 hours planned for you today, so buckle up. This webinar has been in the making for almost a year, because a year ago I first visited the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. This was to attend the World Food Forum and the Committee on Food Security Plenary. And look, in my term as UN Youth Representative on Biodiversity and Food, I have really seen a growing recognition of the key role that youth can play in food systems transformation. But I've also very often seen young people bite their tongue when confronted with youth washing, unequal access to key information, and missing seats at decision-making tables, at multi-stakeholder and multilateral decision-making processes. And I understand this because we are very often very excited and we just feel very privileged to be there. And we have been taught to not look a gift horse in the mouth. But today I want to ask, what if we did? What if we counted every tooth and told each other how we felt about it? What if we had an honest conversation about where we came from, what works and what doesn't, so that we can strengthen our call for meaningful and inclusive youth participation? That is exactly what we aim to do with today's webinar. But before we get into it, I'm wondering what brought you here today. So I'm inviting you to go to the Mentimeter that is linked on our slide so that you can tell us what you are curious about today. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to answer that question. So Bina, are you able to pull up the Mentimeter? Ah, there we go. Okay, so we have an interest in different perspectives and listening to youth and inspiration. I really hope we can make that happen. There's a question if there's a possibility to answer in different languages, and there is for Spanish and for French. I also see an interest in food sovereignty and in intersectionality, human rights, youth engagement, and connection. So we have dialogue added and food sustainability and reconnecting to the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism. Okay, I think this can go on for quite a while, but if we go to our program for today, we can already start seeing the connections. Yeah, so we'll have a short presentation by Sal Vicente Vasquez from the International Indian Treaty Council and the CSIPM, among others, and by Anissa Madden from the University of Vermont. And they will shed some light on the historical but also ongoing struggles that have really shaped participation and youth participation in international food governance. And they will also introduce the current needs and challenges of young people engaged or eager to engage in global food policy making. Then we'll have a panel discussion to explore and also critically analyze the pivotal role youth can play, and also the intricate landscape of international food, nutrition, and agricultural policy, with a specific emphasis maybe on how to really navigate the corporate influence that is gaining foothold in different spaces, and the shrinking of democratic spaces in international institutions. And then we build on these conversations. We are hosting a collective dialogue on what is required for effective, inclusive, and democratic youth participation in global food governance. And this we will do via the breakout rooms, which we've mentioned before. And we're really hoping that today's exchanges can fertilize the grounds for future advocacy and youth participation, and that it can equip youth and maybe also policymakers with the knowledge and tools necessary to build a collective force to shape the future of global food governance. But in this preparation for this webinar, Tylee Terena has also pointed out a very different but very important aspect, which is that we really have to realize that we as youth are not alone in this fight. So Tylee, please share your perspective on this.
Thank you, Ida, and hi everyone. Welcome all of you that are here with us today. This webinar comes with a great idea to show and uplift the voices of the youth in these international spaces. But I want to bring for all of you today a little bit of the indigenous cosmology that is not only for my people, but we share this perspective in for us, the youth cannot walk by itself. We need the guidance and the teachings from our elders, from the ones that have passed through the same way that we are passing right now, and they can share and guide us with their expertise, the experience, what was the challenges that they faced, what was the things that they accomplished. And for my people from the Terena Nation, we have the saying that we walk to the future in the footprint of our ancestors. So I think in this way, that's why we wanted to invite the first speakers. I know they are not youth, but they started this process when they were youth. So they can share a little bit for us what they faced in their time, what they see that has changed, and what they see that is still what we can still do. I also as for everyone, this is a exercise that I always invite the youth to do, because sometimes we have all that we are different from our grandmothers, grandfathers. We have, but there is a lot that we can learn with them, with their stories and with their experiences. So that's why this first moment we decided to invite those two guests. Ida, if you want to invite them, please. I just wanted to make this briefly explanation on why we are starting with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tylee. Over to you, Sal.
Maybe asking again, I don't know if he heard. Hola, Saúl. Por favor, ¿se podría compartir con nosotros un
Hi,
poco?
Saul, if you could share with us how you started this journey. How did it go? How did it start when you were young? Maybe you can inspire other youth to join in this topic. Thank you. Good morning, dear brothers and sisters. First, I would like to read some words in my language to start off and to bring us strength and intelligence to continue in our struggle now that you are the youth taking on responsibilities now. So thank you. I was asked to speak about the historical and current struggles for the participation of civil society and indigenous peoples, and they asked us an initial question, that is, what do we understand by global food governance? So global governance came with the creation of FAO in 1945, then with high-level political summits such as the UN Global Food Conference in Rome in 1974. That was the year where the Committee on World Food Security was created with the purpose of being an intergovernmental body within the United Nations system to follow up and examine policies and programs on global food security. FAO considers global food governance in the following terms. I quote, "Global governance of food security refers to a mechanism that shall facilitate discussions, convergence of opinions, and the coordination of activities to improve global food security, but also at the regional and national level. End of quote. However, the 8th round of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT is the acronym in English, which was held in 1986 in Uruguay, it led to the creation of the World Trade Organization, and it included agriculture in multilateral trade agreements, together with international property and dispute settlement. And since then, food has been used as a good. In 1994, the Marrakesh Agreement established a new multilateral framework to foster the liberalization of agriculture progressively, meaning it facilitated access for companies to financial markets and raw materials through international generalized rules, eliminating many of the national social protections. The Marrakesh Agreement on Agriculture and the creation of the World Trade Organization led to the coordination and mobilization of rural population organizations from around the globe. And we organized also at an international level to react to the devastating impacts of the structural adjustment and the liberalization policies on our livelihoods and rural societies. The World Food Summit at the FAO held in Rome in 1996, a year when more than 800 million people went hungry, was the occasion for our organizations to start thinking about an alternative strategy, a common alternative strategy to strengthen our ability to have a say and influence international policies and create global networks. This movement of small-scale food producers considered that the FAO was an intergovernmental forum for advocacy that could be interesting and could be an alternative to the World Trade Organization and to international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. Since then, we've started a series of struggles which were able to ultimately modify the Committee on World Food Security and to create a space that you are now participating in, that is the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism. Back then, there was no UN initiative that promoted the participation of youth, since there was not even a space for the participation of civil society or social movements. Back then, many of us were young, and from within the space of participation for indigenous peoples, which existed far beyond them, we had a large participation of young people together with older people reclaiming the participation of indigenous peoples. There wasn't an initiative for the specific participation of youth, and even the indigenous people's social movements had failed to think about this. Maybe because the youth back then were not reclaiming sectorial spaces of participation. They were calling for the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples through mobilization and pressuring at an international and national level. And it was precisely this pressure which forced states to open spaces to participation of representatives of indigenous peoples in the UN spaces. Back then at the Human Rights Commission, which is now the Human Rights Council. And shortly after this led to the formalization of indigenous peoples in the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples and in the ad hoc working groups on the drafting of a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Sorry? Apologies for the interruption, Saul. Could you please try lowering the volume and put it in original language, because we are hearing you and also the English interpretation at the same time on the floor. Can you hear me better this way? Could you try moving the microphone closer? Can you hear me this way? I think we can, yes. Can the interpreters hear Saul okay? Yes. Much better, yes. Thank you, Saul, and sorry for the interruption. I've turned off the interpretation, but we can hear you great now, Saul. Thank you. Okay, so as I was saying, the ongoing and permanent mobilization of the indigenous movements in these international spaces and having clear goals made it possible for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to be adopted. And at a later stage, the UN mechanisms were created for indigenous peoples, such as the Permanent Forum, the Mechanism of Experts, and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples mechanism, as part of the Committee on World Food Security, defined the way in which it wanted to participate. In a self-organized way, they decided on who they wanted to participate. They defined their own agenda and promoted the direct participation of different constituencies, including youth, creating a working group on youth. That is where you are participating. Shortly after that, we realized that from the United Nations, a strategy was created to promote the participation of youth in different spaces. And during the current period, this strategy has been strengthened under the argument of generational takeover. It's a strategy targeting civil society because government representatives are not forced to do this. In the case of FAO, the Unit on Indigenous Peoples, which we called for based on our mobilizations. I mean, the first time I went to the FAO, I was kicked out, and I was told that I couldn't talk about rights in FAO, that I should go to Geneva to talk about rights. In any case, thanks to our pressure, we got this unit in place in the FAO, that is the Unit on Indigenous Peoples, which we the self-organized Indigenous Peoples Caucus for Food Sovereignty, which was an organization that was self-organized, which and this unit on Indigenous people created the Youth Caucus, where young people do not participate in a self-organized way, but under the auspices of this FAO unit. However, it's important to highlight that UN spaces are launching initiatives to ensure a larger participation of youth, because it's important for their voices and their proposals to be heard. Social movements have also come up with a stronger strategy to mobilize youth in their movements to promote their participation in international spaces, especially because we're concerned that UN initiatives are intending to capture youth leaderships rather than fostering their self-organization and development, especially more so with current policies in the global south that have strengthened the policies that plunder natural resources, and they know well that youth are the ones that stand in the front lines to defend their territories. So, even when there is a greater recognition that industrial food systems and that the current civilization model is failing, the number of hungry and malnourished people is increasing everywhere in the world. Climate is leading to huge natural disasters. There's an increasing loss of biodiversity, and we see zoonotic diseases emerging. Big capital corporations and the governments that back them are pushing their goal to continue along the same way through what we know as the corporate capture of the UN spaces, which is leading to an increase in food insecurity. It's increasing malnutrition and poverty for large sectors of the global population. And other actors have pointed at this. It is estimated that 690 million people were hungry in 2019, and more than 2 billion lacked access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food on a regular basis. And this was before the COVID-19 pandemic increased the number of hungry by 130 million people and pushed millions more to hunger, and it put at risk a third of the subsistence means of those participating in food production. In a joint call launched at a conference in Berlin in May 2024, more than 50 renowned academics called for new economic policy targeting the causes, and among others, they signaled that liberal democracies today are confronted with a wave of popular mistrust in its ability to serve the majority of citizens and to resolve the many crises challenging a world. This feeling of has been caused by the shifts in globalization with inflation. Also, decades of bad management of globalization and with an overconfidence in market self-regulation and austerity have undermined governments' capacity to respond to these crises in an effective way. We are living in a critical period. Markets alone will not slow down climate change, neither will they reduce inequalities in wealth distribution. And the trickle-down effect has failed. End of quote. This is what we know as the Berlin Declaration. Also, they're weakening the multilateral nature of the United Nations, where we should include those in charge of policies, and now they're turning to a multi-stakeholder approach. It's a governance proposal to advance corporate capture of global food governance. Multi-stakeholderism, as we know it, shares distinctions between public interest and business profit, between the rich and those excluded, between governments and corporations. It has a subtle narrative. They say we're all on the same boat to face the many crises affecting our planet. So what they're saying is that we all share the same responsibility, but we're all different. This approach stops them from looking at the structural causes and the drivers of these systemic crises that our planet and our people are facing. We cannot ignore or deny the huge damage caused by corporate actors and industrial food systems on people, health, environment, climate, social justice, and economic justice and democracy. The lack of accountability and on the side of corporations is leading to impunity. We sustain that in UN spaces, we must ensure a full and effective participation of social movements of small-scale food producers, and more specifically for youth, but not for a generational turnover, but rather in the sense that young people are promoting in Latin America and the Caribbean. They say, I quote, "Indigenous youth are the hinge that transitions between childhood and adulthood and between older generations, and that is why they play a responsibility in our respect for our Mother Earth and cultural and biological diversity. Indigenous youth are developing their skills to bring together all of these diversities and to convey knowledge through intergenerational dialogue and looking into the future." And to conclude, I would like to share the words of a young Indigenous person who said, I quote, "I wish to continue walking on the fallen leaves, to bathe in the pools, to wake up to the call of the birds, and at night to listen to the story of my father and grandmother. And that is why, as long as mining companies continue to rob this from us, I will continue my struggle." These are the words of Ubaldino Garcia Canan, a young Indigenous man from the Maya Chorti people. That would be all on my side. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope my contribution is useful.
Thank you so much for your wisdom. So I'll now hand it to Anissa Merten.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here with you all. And thank you, Saul, for sharing this important historical context of the struggles of peasant and Indigenous movements for space and voice in these important political decision-making spaces. I'm going to speak a little bit about now the ongoing struggles for meaningful youth participation and about some of the strategies of the civil society and Indigenous peoples mechanism of the youth to address these issues. And I'll speak a little bit just from my experience as a co-facilitator of the CSIPM Youth Working Group and my observations of some of the other global food governance processes like the World Food Forum of the FAO and the UN World Economic Forum Food Systems Summit. So we could go to the next slide, please. As Saul just explained, in the last few decades, there has been a proliferation of global food governance spaces, processes, and fora, which are now being called multi-stakeholder platforms. And young people are being increasingly invited to participate in these multi-stakeholder spaces. But as many of you have already experienced, many of these mechanisms may appear inclusive, but ultimately serve the interest of established power structures of governments and agribusiness corporations that benefit from the status quo. As a result, youth are often instrumentalized and tokenized in these processes. Some of the ways that this happens, young people may be invited in a very ad hoc manner without attention to who might be missing and in a way that fragments and undermines grassroots processes of self-organization and political formation. Also, the topics and organization of these sessions are usually set in advance by elite actors, rather than collectively and democratically discussed, debated, and self-organized. These issues raise concerns about democratic accountability and legitimacy. Also, issues such as climate change, hunger, displacement, poverty are often mentioned, but there's little political analysis of what is causing these issues or of the differentiated impacts on young people who are facing forms of discrimination and marginalization, state violence, and human rights violations. Often in these spaces, false solutions are often preset beforehand and focus on policies that support technological innovation and the further industrialization and commercialization of agriculture. It's very hard then for youth to change the framing at a later stage, and this sidelines truly transformative proposals and framings. And we've seen these issues both in the World Food Forum and in the UN Food Systems Summit. Another issue is that the formal and elite nature of these global governance spaces and the speed at which these policy discussions take place make it easier for academically trained English-speaking youth from the global north, like myself, to navigate them and can put young people who come from different contexts at a structural disadvantage. Those who have less access to communication technologies, whose first language is not English, whose primary expertise may not be in UN policy worlds, but in grassroots organizing or farming. And these factors exacerbate already existing inequities, where those who are already structurally marginalized and excluded from these discussions face greater barriers to participate meaningfully and effectively. Finally, there are differences in resources, in access to funding, and the ability to move across borders more easily. This leads to a situation where those in urban areas, those with better access to digital technologies and infrastructure are able to participate in virtual meetings with more stability, and those with access to funding and passports and visas can travel in person to these spaces. We saw, for example, at the CFS in 2019, when the private sector mechanism funded the participation of over 50 youth, and the CSIPM could only support the participation of 6 young people. So it's very important to consider who's financing youth participation and why. So these issues highlight how important it is for all of us to critically engage with these participatory opportunities in a way that recognizes the differentiated contexts, histories, and contemporary struggles faced by young people around the world, and for us to engage in meaningful dialogue and find ways to support and elevate the political leadership of those on the front lines, young small-scale food providers themselves. Next slide, please. So as Saul already mentioned, there are mechanisms created by social movements and organizations. The first is the IPC, which was formed in 2002. Its role is to engage with the Food and Agriculture Organization, but even though it has existed for more than 20 years, the participation still must be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. The IPC still has no formal right to participate in FAO processes. Whereas the civil society and Indigenous peoples mechanism, which was formed in 2010 by the organizations of the IPC and supported by international civil society organizations, won the right to participate in policymaking processes at the UNCFS. And that means it's able to engage in all stages of policymaking, contribute to expert research reports, and be involved in governance matters through an advisory group. So this gives them the capacity to engage politically in all aspects of global food governance at the CFS. Next slide, please. We can go to the next slide. Thank you so much. So what makes the CFS and the CSIPM so unique? Well, the reform of the CFS in 2009 was struggled for and won by social movements. It really came from the bottom up. The CFS was reformed to recognize the structural nature of the food crisis and the centrality of human rights, and it has committed to work towards the progressive realization of the right to food. Perhaps the most important principle of the CFS is that it is prioritizing the voices of those most affected by food insecurity. That is, those who produce the majority of the world's food, small-scale food providers, Indigenous peoples, and workers. And again, today, the CFS is the only UN space where civil society has the right to participate, and this right is outlined in clear mechanisms. That is not to say that it is still a struggle to defend and uphold that right, but it is there. Next slide, please. So how does the CSIPM ensure the voices of those most affected are prioritized? The CSIPM's core mandate is to facilitate the participation of the organizations and movements of rights-holding constituencies. So I guess the principle of facilitation is more than just techniques like reflective listening or consensus building, but it has a very explicit political meaning and focus. Its role is to counter historical and ongoing legacies of exclusion from global governance spaces. And it is also internal, recognizing and working to address historical and ongoing power imbalances within and between civil society organizations and social movements. So when it comes to engaging in international food governance spaces, facilitation as it is practiced in the CSIPM asks the question and seeks to respond to the question, how do we organize so that we don't reproduce the power imbalances we are seeking to transform? So the CSIPM has a structure that prioritizes the voices of food providers and workers, Indigenous peoples and peoples from the Global South, via a participatory infrastructure of 11 constituencies across 17 subregions. 10 of these constituencies are considered those most effective, whereas non-governmental organizations are considered a supporting constituency. This is to make sure that those with the lived experience, those on the front lines, are speaking for themselves rather than being represented by others. So staff of NGOs and academics like myself, we often play a technical support role, organizing meetings, taking notes, and supporting the self-organization and political protagonism of social movements. And very importantly, the CSIPM respects the autonomy of movements and organizations. So they organize from the ground up, and they engage in their own consultative processes to build stronger political decision-making that is rooted in the lived realities, needs, struggles, and aspirations for food sovereignty. Next slide, please. And finally, and very importantly, facilitation is not just about addressing power relations out there. It also seeks to tackle inequities within the CSIPM between constituencies, regions, genders, life stages. And in this sense, facilitating participation is part of the transformative aim of food sovereignty, to build a culture of solidarity between diverse peoples joined in a common struggle to rebalance historical power inequities and create new social relations free of oppression. So how does the CSIPM do this? It works to support and attend to collective internal reflection and discussion on power imbalances, to build a culture of care, of safer spaces, and of solidarity for collective transformation. And it is also not to forget that, as I was reminded recently by a wise movement elder, that just because we are part of a movement for radical change does not mean we are better than others. So we should not be afraid to ask questions, to say that we don't know, to critically reflect on our own assumptions and biases. By working in a spirit of humility, of openness and togetherness, we are co-creating our own spaces for debate and formation, spaces of co-learning, creativity, and empathy and respect. And this seminar, this dialogue that has been organized by and for youth is a wonderful example of such an approach. And it's these questions and others that we're here to explore and discuss. So I will now hand it over to the youth panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anissa, for sharing all of that and also ending on these really, really interesting questions that we are also asking ourselves during this webinar. We are on to our next territory for exploration, which is a panel where we have invited diverse youth to reflect on their experiences. And their experiences are really in a lot of different nooks and niches that they inhabit in, let's say, the ecosystem of UN food governance spaces. So we've made a little governance map here, but this is very far from complete because there's a lot of different mechanisms and fora and decision-making spaces that are important when we talk about food governance. But these are just some of the ones that our panelists are involved in. So if we go to the next slide, we can properly introduce them because they're incredible people. Our conversation will feature Moise Mbimbe and Tai Li from the CSIPM, Bina Lim, who is my colleague, youth representative on Biodiversity and Food, Nicolas Domke Venegas, who is the coordinator of the Chilean chapter of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, also a youth representative in the SENA group of the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub, and also a former World Food Forum Youth Policy Board member. And last but not least, Saskia Drossers, who is a young researcher on youth participation in international food governance. And this panel will be moderated by the brilliant Dr. Jessica Duncan, who is a professor in the politics of food systems transformation. Over to you, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you, Ida, and thank you, everyone. It's truly an honor to facilitate this panel. I'm dating myself a bit here, but back in 2006, I attended my first UN climate conference, COP12, as a youth climate activist. And I found the experience so equally overwhelming and underwhelming that I ended up disengaging completely from those policy spaces. So needless to say, I'm really thrilled that today, 20 years later, I get to learn from these youth who are engaging in these spaces in more productive and constructive ways. So I've been asked to structure this panel in two parts. First, I'm going to ask the panelists to reflect on their own experiences as youth engaged in global food governance spaces and beyond. Then, for the second part of the panel, once we're all warmed up, I want to ask the panelists to interact a bit more and discuss why youth participation matters and how we can improve it. I see we're still missing one panelist, so I'll just wait. I want to also, as we wait for our last panel member, reiterate Ida's call to look critically at these open spaces for youth participation, and echo Anissa's call to reflect critically on our own assumptions and biases, and to do this creatively and openly. So is Moisa joining us?
I think he has to turn on his video for us to spotlight him, but he is part of the call.
Perfect, thank you, Saskia. So I'll start with Tylee. You're currently a member of the CSIPM. Could you briefly share your experiences, maybe focusing on how you're bringing the perspective of Indigenous youth into international food governance spaces?
Thank you, Jessica. I hope you guys can hear me. I know my sorry. I hope my audio it's good for all of you. The connection here sometimes is not that good. So sharing a little bit of my experiences. I'm new in the youth working group in the CSIPM. Me and Moise, we were nominated this year. So I'm new in this process, but I've been involved in this topic in other mechanisms in the UN. I started in the UNFCCC, where we are talking about climate change. And I started there because my region is being affected in a really bad way by agribusiness industry. And food is something that is really deep related with my community. We were considered by anthropologists and by the colonizer as agricultural people. Even though that back in the time we used to hunt, we already had our own techniques on what is today called agroforest. And unfortunately, because of the agribusiness industry impacts in our region, for example, now we had problems related with water, the contamination by agropesticides, and other issues related to. So I started to get involved with there in UNFCCC system, and then now getting more involved at FAO. So for me, it's kind of big challenge to participate in this process. I think first of all is the language barrier. And for example, I come from Brazil where we speak Portuguese, and I had to learn another language to make the voice of my people to be heard on those spaces. If I didn't not spoke another language, I think it would be really difficult for people to hear the demands and the problems that my community is facing right now. So the language barrier is a big problem. And I think the other issue is the thing about to be an expert. So you only be respected in these spaces if you're an expert in some issue, you know? If you have a background, academic background, or if you are a professional in some specific area. And for us as Indigenous peoples, our knowledge, our science are different from the non-Indigenous. So it's difficult, I think, sometimes for us to be respected and considered as a new, or it's not new actually, it's more older than the Western science. But I think these new methodologies that we bring to the table sometimes needs to be more respected. So it's difficult when we go to those spaces, facing all these difficulties that we face, and then we have to prove that our knowledge and our science are real. So I think it's really important for us, when we talk about decolonization on those spaces, is for us to break the barriers that our elders created for us. And I really liked when Saul brought it, for example, the capture of the youth, or as Anissa said, as the tokenism of the youth. Because most of the time when we are invited to those spaces, we are limited and on what we have to say, on what is our spaces and what we can bring to the table. But I like that as being a youth, we need to be rebel. We need to bring this energy that we have, bring this energy of new perspectives, to break those barriers that is there. And I brought in the beginning the sentence of the teachings from my people. We walk to the future in the footprints of our ancestors, because for us it's really important to remember what was made by the elders, what they did and what they accomplished. So we don't repeat the same mistakes that they did, but bringing a new, different perspectives as youth. So I think this is the most energy point that the youth can contribute. I think we have a lot of energy, and not to settle down with what they input, they push for us, but bringing these new perspectives.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tali, for that excellent intervention. I'd like to turn to Nicholas now, if I may. Nicholas, you have a lot of experience working with the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub and the World Food Forum. I want to ask you if you can elaborate a bit on what you personally are hoping to achieve for youth through your participation, and what you hope youth more broadly can achieve by engaging.
And thank you, Jessica. Before to answer, I want to let the audience know that I will give my answer in Spanish so they can switch to the interpretation. So ahora en español. Gracias por la pregunta.
I'm going to speak Spanish. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this session. Personally, I come from youth leadership. I represent students at my university. I did this during the pandemic, and then I started representing a group of persons who were suffering difficulties during challenging moments at the global level, representing them at national level with national authorities, as well as at my university. I was moderating for trying to give solutions during the conflict. Now, given my academic background, like many youth from all over the world, seeing how things are happening at the global scale, such as the summit, which took place in 2021. I watched this over the computer, and I saw that it wasn't possible to participate in a global scale. And so I was very motivated to apply to the Youth Policy Board of the World Food Forum. And some months later, given that I had this role as youth at World Food Forum, I was selected as youth representative for the UN mechanism related to food systems. There is a system whereby votes are counted for choosing applicants, candidates. And I wanted to see what were the mechanisms by which youth can reach such a position at the global level. I'm sharing this position with a girl from Kenya and another third person from another country so that we can cover several geographical areas. I wanted to represent a group which has needs, which is suffering from climate change, from pollution, from the biodiversity crisis. It's a very challenging position at the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. I took on this role and then started consulting and getting to know better that at the UN level,
de dar un mandato a una institución
back at the 2021 summit, no decision was taken. But they did decide to make an advisory group, which helped us to have, through these national continuums, better communication with national authorities. Through this UN Food Systems Coordination Hub, and they weren't really very much aware of our work. I got in touch with the regional FAO office in my country, in Santiago in Chile, and at the FAO regional office, they really weren't very aware about this position that I had at the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. And because of this, it was hard to have consultations, to have surveys, to get the opinions of youth. So at the beginning, it was quite limited within the mechanism to get the support of countries. The CSIPM, the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Committee at the CFS, at the Committee on World Food Security, are stronger. They have that strength. As Anissa showed, there are certain groups there, certain seats taken by constituencies, by marginalized peoples, and they are more representative because of the number of seats that they have at the CFS. So when it comes to participation in global food governance, these type of mechanisms are the most important because they give a certain credibility or validity to these voices, whereas even though I was personally motivated to want to construct bridges, nevertheless, just like other colleagues here present, who have a mechanism behind them, who do represent the voices of hundreds of thousands of people who are affected across the territories within the food systems and food and agricultural governance. These are some of the challenges that I face. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for that clear intervention and raising some of these differences and challenges across these spaces. I want to now go to Moise if he's there. Maybe.
Oui, je suis là, vous m'entendez?
Oui, on vous entend. So, and we'll ask you the question in English, but Ida already mentioned you're a youth coordinator for the CSIPM, and Nicholas just explained a little bit about the difference between what he's experiencing at the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub and what's happening at the CSIPM. Can you explain a little bit about what being a youth coordinator means to you and why, from your perspective and your experience, youth participation in the CSIPM is important?
Oui, Jessica, merci de me passer la parole.
Yes, Jessica, thanks for giving me the floor. I had a problem with my internet connection. I hope you can hear me okay. So I'm Moise Bimbe, and I'm the youth coordinator at the CSIPM in collaboration with CFS. I'm the co-coordinator associated with the youth. I'd like to recall that the mechanism was created in 2010 after an important decision taken by the World Food Security to give a space or to give more space to the voices of those people who are affected by food insecurity and malnutrition, but who paradoxically are often the ones that feed the world, small food producers. Now, the CSIPM is organized in different working groups: biodiversity, gender, equity, food governance, youth, and other working groups. Each of these working groups is represented in the coordination committee with 2 members and 2 alternates, and I am as the youth coordinator, together with Taini, one of the 2 youth representatives in the coordination committee. And our goal is to bring the voice of youth into the coordination committee and beyond the coordination committee. When talking of food systems and the right to food, these are topics that are discussed taking into consideration the full diversity of members within the CSIPM. So we are there to mobilize youth and to voice their concerns, and we support the facilitators of the working group and our members to advance the food security agenda and the agenda for an effective right to food. On the issue of what motivated me to participate in the CSIPM, as I was saying before, the CSIPM, and Anissa touched on this, it brings the voice of civil society and indigenous peoples to this Committee on World Food Security, which is an important body within the FAO. I won't go back to that because several people have mentioned this before. And the CSA is the space where small-scale food producers and peasants and fisher folk and indigenous peoples, youth, women, and agricultural workers. These are all people who have access to land, and very often they are the people who most suffer from food insecurity. So it's a way of bringing them into this space, the CSIPM, that brings all of these constituencies together to make their voices heard in the Committee on World Food Security. So it's a very necessary space. It's a space where we must participate to make our voices heard in the Committee on World Food Security and to participate in the conversations and discussions on global food governance. So it's a body that's part of the UN system, and it ensures the participation of social movements, civil society, and food producers in monitoring and participating in discussions on food policy. So it's a space for us to bring our voices to, and that is something I've been engaged in for many years now. And also as a participant in the working group on youth, we contributed to recommendations on the participation of youth and the employment of young people in the agricultural food systems. And this ultimately, in 2022, led to the adoption of these policy recommendations. So it's symbolic for a young rural person like myself. And it's an opportunity, a unique opportunity to bring the voices of young people. Sorry, there was an open mic. So I was saying it's a unique opportunity to bring the voice of young people into this specific space. And very often it's young people who face the problems of climate change and deforestation, which have a strong impact on food security and food systems. So I'd just like to recall how important these topics are, especially when we take into account that many of these places are deeply impacted by climate change. So the CFS is an opportunity for us to bring the issue of land tenure to the CFS. It's essential when looking at the participation of youth in the food system. So I'd like to leave it at that, but before then I'd like to conclude by saying it's important for myself, and I would encourage other young people who are not yet engaged to participate in the CSIPM, because it's a space where we can bring the voices of many millions of people. It's a space of solidarity that allows us to work together to defend our rights and to defend food sovereignty. It's us, the small-scale food producers, our brothers and sisters in our fields who feed the world. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think in the interventions we've heard so far, you've all highlighted that it's not just about youth participation, but it's about the representation of particular youth that represent particular affected constituencies. And Saskia, I think this is a nice segue to the work you've been doing. You've been researching and interviewing many youth involved in global governance spaces, particularly the World Food Forum, which you yourself, I understand, attended. So could I ask you to share what stood out for you in your own research and from your own experience? And what can you sort of reflect on a bit in terms of the spaces available to youth?
Yeah, I think it's really beautiful, first and foremost, to hear the experiences of my other panelists, and also the emphasis placed on good structures of participation, not just being invited, but being able to participate in a structural manner where you know that your voice will be listened to in some way, but also having to fight for that still. What I really noticed at the World Food Forum is that, particularly during the opening and the closing ceremony, these high-level officials were speaking, like presidents and kings and representatives from countries, and they are all saying that youth matter, that we are the future leaders, that we are the change makers, and that we should hold them responsible for the decisions, and that we should have all this power and all this influence to make a change. But then if you're actually in those spaces where youth are invited to participate in the World Food Forum, you really do notice that the structures aren't there when it comes to the World Food Forum. I attended a lot of the assemblies, and what you saw there was a big group of youth coming together to discuss policy priorities. And it often started with half an hour of a presentation by someone who was older to teach us about how this space was meant to be organized and big issues. And then we were invited to speak amongst ourselves whilst they left the room. And then afterwards, policy documents were created, but no one has any idea where they go to, who they are shared with, what structures of accountability are available. And that is a really big issue that I noticed. There is a huge amount of input being raised by surveys in these assemblies, which is very important and very good information. And we should all be able to make our voices heard. But if we don't know where that information is going next, that is a big issue that I noticed. And I see that youth are still really having to fight for access to these spaces every single time, like case-to-case basis. It's a constant struggle to be invited, to be able to have more than 5 minutes of a presentation, and then to say something that is truly meaningful and goes beyond youth should be able to participate, which is often the only thing that you're allowed to say. So I think that it's really important to be critical of these spaces that we engage in, and that we look at more than just being invited, but that we're being invited and then listened to, and then that their input is being used in some way and incorporated, instead of just sitting there for a photo looking pretty.
Yeah, thanks, Saskia. I want to now turn to Binna. So you're also very familiar with global decision-making spaces outside of food security and food systems. You are a Dutch youth representative for the UN. And I want to ask you, how do the experiences of your fellow panelists resonate with your own experiences engaging in governance for beyond those focused on food? And I'm curious if you were in charge of redesigning participatory mechanisms, maybe this isn't a fair question, but I'm going to ask it. What would you do to facilitate or improve the participation of youth?
So I've been a youth representative for almost a year now, and I've participated in some global governance processes like the legally binding plastic treaty or the environmental assembly from the UN. So it's a bit different than Rome-based agencies, and they're being part of the Dutch delegation, which is of course a very privileged position to be in as a youthful person. I got access to like all the things that I needed, like all the European license take or the classified documents. And when comparing that to people that I've spoken with and their experiences with processes around the FAO, it's completely different. It really my mandate allows me to go to the World Food Forum, into the CFS, but I really feel like those agencies are quite closed, especially when I compare it to the experiences that I had so far. And for reformation of youth participation, or how you pose the question, I can actually just endorse what Saskia said about youth participation, not taking it for granted, making sure that everybody is heard, and also what Anissa said in the beginning, who do we have now, who are we including, but also who are we missing? Try to make it accessible as possible online as well as physical, but also try to make sure, like we try to make this event as inclusive as possible, to that we made sure we have translations, but also we don't have all translations, so there's still room for improvement. It's never perfect, and we try to strive for that. So yeah, youth participation, don't take it for granted. I feel like that's the thing I would like to finish with. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. So with that, I want to move on to the second part of our panel. I think recognizing that we don't want to take youth participation for granted, I think the question we still maybe are dancing around and could use some more clarity on is, why is youth participation important? Why does it matter? And I'm curious to know from you all if it's even worth the trouble, right? You've talked about lack of legitimacy, lack of awareness. I'm being a bit facetious here and provocative, but I want to know from your perspectives, why does it matter? So Tylee, I want to start with you. Can you tell us a bit why it's important for youth to participate, especially Indigenous youth to participate in global food governance spaces? And what specifically are you hoping to achieve for youth through your participation? And I'd ask the other panelists to follow up on her comments. So Tylee, over to you.
Yes, just writing so I don't keep talking and don't answer the question. Let me do again like this, so I think you guys can hear me better. So why it's important for Indigenous youth to participate in this process? Once I've heard from an elder, when I first time attended a meeting, a UN meeting, and I got really upset, first of all, and disappointed, because I thought that, oh my God, I'm going to a space that the leaders, both leaders, are talking about the solutions and actions that the planet needed. And oh my God, I was so optimistic. And I got really disappointed. I got really sad. And I was like, I don't want to come to this space anymore, because it's violent with our bodies, it's violent with our knowledge and with our identity. Why I want to come back to these spaces? I'd rather to be in my community, like working in the ground, But then he said to me, kid, when we are not in the table eating the dinner together, we are being served in a menu. So if we, as youth, and now I'm going to say as youth, generally saying, if we are not there to speak our own needs, what is our perspectives, what is our proposals, people maybe will not even talk about it. What Saskia said, like a lot of them talk about youth, but how many of those countries' representatives are really engaging with the youth? How many of them are really hearing, and not only hearing, how can I say, oh my God, I missed the word in English. But when you say like, we bring the proposal and now they have to implement, how we gonna guarantee that they will implement what we are proposing? If it's not us speaking for ourselves in those spaces, if it's not us leading the spaces for the youth, someone else would do that. And when they do that, there's no guarantee that they are doing a good way, in a representative way. So I think this is the main important thing, and not only for Indigenous youth. I think Indigenous youth have a bigger responsibility in that, because all the process and the barriers that cross our bodies in those spaces that I mentioned in the other question. And the second part, you said what I want to achieve in those spaces. You said that, yes?
Yeah, just very briefly, please. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. What I want to achieve, it's to be respected, considered, and that what we are proposing is really being implemented. Because now the challenge is the food production in the planet will change drastically. And we need to have opportunities to guarantee that the youth can continue in the rural areas producing the foods, because nowadays there is a lot of attractives in the cities that make the youth migrated from there. So I really want to achieve a better commitment from the countries, from the states and the representatives, that we can continue do what we are doing in our own communities, in our own field, guarantee that the youth can continue in these spaces of growing food to feed the planet.
Thank you, Tylee. An important reminder to hold our states accountable. Maybe I'll ask Moise to come in, talk about your experience as a young farmer and why it's particularly important to have your voices heard.
Oui, pour moi,
Yes, I mean, for me, the participation of youth is a proof that we have to take hold of our situation, and we need to be in decision spaces, because if we don't sit there, they'll be taken by others and they won't be able to solve the problems. They can't take decisions without us. It's something that happens very often when we're not there. It's also a matter of intergenerational justice. As young leaders, we hold a responsibility towards other youth and also to the younger generations. If we allow for predator policies to be put in place, those coming after us will face terrible situations. There's a threat of things getting worse. So that is why it's important that we participate in decision-making spaces for our own interests, but also for those coming after us. If we aren't there, the agro-industry will take the floor and they'll push for land grabbing, and they will have predatory policies put in place. So I would say that, to conclude, that no one can share our opinions, our proposals, and our opinions better than ourselves, because we are the ones facing the problems, and we know what the sustainable solutions may be to these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, very well said. I noticed some hands up by participants. Just to let you know, we'll start a question and answer in about 10 minutes, so you can ask your questions then. Nicholas, can I get you to jump in here? And maybe elaborate a bit on diversity and solidarity across food governance spaces when it comes to youth mobilization, building on these points around intergenerational justice, accountability, and autonomy that have been brought up by your fellow panelists.
Thank you, Jessica. Back to Spanish. Considerándome como,
Well,
como un
as a young man, a young professional, coming from a generation that moved from the fields to the cities and looking for better conditions, or maybe something as basic as having a better internet connection to participate in these spaces, I think that participating in food system governance spaces is a way of giving back to those fields that have fed my generations for generations without having to be there physically working the land. So with this in mind, I think it's really important to continue pushing and pressuring our governments in these international spaces to bring legitimacy into those spaces that have been won thanks to the struggles of many years. I think these new spaces that are emerging under the auspices of FAO, such as the World Food Forum. Sorry about that. I was saying these new spaces, we need to bring the legitimacy of what has been achieved through many years of efforts and to allow young people who maybe I'm the first in my family to have been to university, to allow them to participate in the conversations. As authorities say, we need to break down silos. We have young people coming from different realities, and sometimes we find it hard to break out of those silos and to understand the positions or the realities of other people who have met other challenges and have crossed other barriers. I'm optimistic, and I think these spaces can generate a space where everyone can come in different conditions, wearing different hats, to say, with different levels of representation. But that doesn't mean their voice is less valuable. So it's a space where we see different realities converge. And that is why I think it's important to promote participation in these spaces. Thank you.
I'm going to open it up now to Bina and Saskia to comment on what you've heard and to add on in terms of why youth participation matters. How do we strengthen connections across youth spaces, across youth movements, etc. Who wants to start? Bina, let's start with you, and then we'll move to Saskia.
I think I can only underline what the people before me already said. I feel like youth participation is a right. It's our right to concern ourselves with what will happen in the future, because if the people who are going to make decisions now about the future won't be there anymore, then what's the point of governing? You know, like it almost feels too logical to not have youth participation in governmental structures or in any kind of structures. Yeah, Saskia, do you want to?
Thanks. And Saskia, maybe how do we do that without this problem of tokenism or multi-stakeholderism and not being sort of taken seriously, that we've already heard about these challenges?
I think it is really about taking the lessons that we have already learned and what the people before us have already learned. We have already learned that power relations exist, power inequalities exist, and that those cannot be ignored. That youth inherently will have less power in these spaces because we are younger, less experienced, and therefore may be seen as lesser. But we need to address these power inequalities, and we need to build structures and participation that take those into account to prioritize those people most affected, as also said in our presentations, and to put their voices central. I think that is really important what we're also doing here today by listening to people like Taylor, like Moise, like Nicholas, who have already been through these struggles, historical struggles as well, and to bring their voices to the public. I think that is really important, that we really decide who we want to listen to and who gets to represent whom. And by structuring that in a good way and taking all of those processes into account, and also looking at accountability, like how do we then take this input and move it forward? Who is listening and what are they going to do with our voices? I think, and also being involved in those processes from the beginning to the end, and not just being consulted for a little moment halfway, that we get to be active participants in these processes and that we get to have a say.
Fantastic. Thanks, Saskia. So we have about 5 minutes left for our panel, and I know this is about prioritizing and listening to youth. But when we were preparing, Kylie, you reminded us about the importance of learning from our elders and thinking about future generations. You spoke about walking to the future in the steps of our elders, but Moise brought up the point of intergenerational justice and thinking about future generations. And with this sort of dynamic in mind, I'd like to ask each of you to share one lesson or one idea, one thing you've learned from your elders, or one thing you want to transmit to future generations that you are now applying to enhance youth participation in global governance spaces. So Nicholas, I'll invite you to go first.
Tough question, I think, because my elders were just in the farm, so they were not knowing anything about UN system or global food governance. But they always said that the one that wake up early have more hours in the day to do the job. So I think all the youth have to wake up, being with our eyes and ears really open about the current situation that we are facing globally, and with that, taking action during our day. Thank you.
Thank you. Very clear. Saskia.
Yeah, that is a hard one. I think I would like to think about something that I want to give to future generations, which is to look forward. Always keep looking forward at what you can do next, and also what you want to bring to other people next, because I think it's easy to get caught up in the moment now and look at what is now necessary, but we need long-term vision. We need long-term plans that are going to actually sustain us for decades to come, and also sustain the generations for decades to come. So I think that image of always looking forward and trying to not look in 5 years time or 10 years time, but think about how you would want generations 5 or 6 next to live. I think that is really important, because I think we're getting so lost in what is happening now that we forget to imagine the future and what we would like that to hold.
Thank you. Bina.
I think I would like to give the next generation a message in which you always think about, you always have a certain type of thought with you about what am I doing now, which will, and how it will impact the future, and how I always like translate these types of thoughts into like a mantra, so to say, is I would like to see my children, if I ever get children, to recognize the world that I have lived in. So I would like to conserve it as much as possible, and that's something that I would like to live with. Yeah.
Thank you. Moise, what lessons from your elders would you like to share, or a learning that you'd like to transmit to the future?
Oui, la leçon que je retiens de ceux qui m'ont précédé.
Yes, based on what the others have previously said, echoing the previous speakers, is that yes, we have to stay on the side of justice. We must not take this for granted, because in capitalism, we're not always on the side of justice, or they're not always on the side of the justice, but those of us who are, we are on the right side of justice. We will continue our struggles.
And Sally, we'll give you the last word.
Thank you, Jessica. Pardon. Sorry. So, in summarizing, is just to say, be a good ancestor. We are youth right now, but we are gonna be the ancestor of someone. So remember that what we are enjoying right now is because someone opened the space for us. Continue to open the space for the future generations. Be a good ancestor.
Wise words from everyone on the panel. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, giving us hope, maintaining a critical and open mindset. I know it sounds cheesy, but I'm feeling a lot more optimistic now about the future, having listened to you all. And with that, I'd like to pass back to Ida.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think we're all virtually clapping. I don't want to disturb you too much with the noise, but I've really loved listening to you. And coming back to Saskia's question, who's speaking? Who do we listen to? I think it's time to maybe see who's listened to you and if there's any questions. I see that Dembo and Amidou have had their hands up. We have to keep this segment quite short because we want to get into a dialogue. But I will give the floor to Amidou if you want to ask your question briefly and direct it to one person so it's clear who you're asking. Amidou, are you with us?
Bonsoir tout le monde.
Yes, good evening, everyone. My name is Amidou. I'm in Mali. And I'm working here for an association and organization of activists. We work with women and youth who are victims of land grabbing. So as youth, as said, we want to participate in the governance of natural resources because it is very capital oriented. Youth need to be at the leadership of governance of natural resources. So in this framework, we have organized ourselves into a mechanism, a dialogue and consultation mechanism for women and for youth, so that both women and youth can participate in the governance of natural resources. So we started organizing meetings. We need to get women to come together and cover the themes which they need to discuss. We're coming all the way from irrigation to land access and other governance issues, and secure tenure of land for women as well. Those are the areas we work on. And we really highlight the value of women and youth participation in decision making, because as our nation develops, as our communities develop, what we see is that we have a moral duty as youth to participate in decision making. As a young person, I'm an activist in human rights. And we therefore discuss issues that are absolutely key. Ensuring that the voice of youth can go further. What we see is that capitalism is dominating our lives. We need to really gain some terrain here, because literally what's happening is capitalism is taken over as an ideology, taking over from colonialism and imperialism. So as youth, those of us who are here today, it's up to us now to find ways so that future generations can also have security, have a future livelihood, because what we saw is that capitalism has impacted our grandparents and so on. So this space is so important for us, for the youth, and therefore we need a mechanism so that we can have secure tenure of our natural resources, of our land. We are fighting against land grabbing because we have been following many cases. We have in fact intervened in many legal cases too, because we have seen that so many victims of land grabbing need support here, and we have supported them. So we work in trade unions as well, and we develop several strategies to support them in these cases of land grabbing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a lot of food for thought that we can build on in our dialogue segment. For now, I would like to thank everyone who's spoken so far and everyone who's listened so far, because now it's time to stop the recording so that we can give space to more intimate sharings in the breakout rooms. So I'll just give our co-organizers a moment to stop the recording. And for